Hello, change makers. It's great to have you back on Food for Thought Friday. I'm your host, Allie Tomlinson, the director of Community of Champions. And as most of you know, Community of Champions is an advocacy program funded by the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities and powered by Friendship Community Care. Now, our mission is to turn every Arkansan into an advocate for themselves or each other. And we envision communities full of champions advocating for individuals with developmental disabilities. So we strive to educate and inspire and empower peer advocates, self-advocates, and state leaders to really understand the importance behind advocacy and how it brings our communities closer together, in turn, growing our state to its maximum potential. But we know you can't be a strong advocate without having strong resources. So we put together an amazing segment for you today. And that amazing segment involves a very special guest who is going to teach us about all things fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And through this, we will learn how to be a better and a stronger advocate for individuals living with FASD. Now, I want to introduce to you Dr. Elizabeth Cleveland. Now, she is an assistant professor at the University of Central Arkansas in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders. Now, she's also the co-director of the Training for the Arkansas Regional Leadership Education and Neurodevelopment Disabilities Training Program and is the co-director of the Specialty Diagnostic Resource Center, Arkansas Specialist for Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders, Diagnostic and Resources. Now, her research is in executive functioning in children who have FASD and how that set of skills is involved with language and social skills. I think Dr. Cleveland is the perfect person for us to talk to about FASD. Welcome, Dr. Cleveland.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm
Thank
excited to be
you.
here.
We are excited to have you here. Now, FASD is something that we have never covered on Food for Thought Friday. So we're really, really happy to have you here.
Great.
If it's okay with you, I really want to do an overview of what FASD actually is.
Sure. So fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, that is an umbrella term that's describing a whole collection of diagnoses. And each of those diagnoses is the result of prenatal exposure to alcohol. The most profound of the FASDs is what's called fetal alcohol syndrome. That's probably what most people, if you've heard of FASDs at all, it's probably fetal alcohol syndrome. Yes, most people. When I was going through school, we had about a paragraph in our in our neurology textbook on it, and I think that's actually still the case in most programs. So I'm not surprised that you haven't had anybody else talking about this. It's just, unfortunately, one of those areas that's under researched. So I'm, like I said, I'm thrilled to be here talking about this subject that I'm so passionate about. So if we are thinking about this umbrella term of FASD and fetal alcohol syndrome, which is associated with facial dysmorphia and some growth problems, it's the most profound of the spectrum. There are also other diagnoses, several other diagnoses that are under that umbrella of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. So keep in mind that FASD is not a diagnosis. It's a category of diagnoses, okay? The other diagnoses under that umbrella, like I said, there are several. Most of them are considered medical diagnoses. So they need a physician to diagnose them. They need a doctor to diagnose them. And then there's a couple of other conditions, one in particular that our clinic focuses on, that's called neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. It's a mouthful, so we shorten it to NDPAE, and that's more of a clinical diagnosis. That criteria is found in the DSM-5. And like I said, that is what the Specialty Diagnostic Resource Center evaluates for, is NDPAE. And, I think a couple of other things to keep in mind when we're thinking about FASDs is that I know that we've all heard the term, or perhaps you have heard the term, invisible disability. A lot of times that term is used in regards to autism spectrum disorder, but this is another one of those disorders that can fall into that same category. It's actually a perfect way to describe FASDs because most of the diagnoses under the umbrella are not associated with any kind of facial features or dysmorphias or physical disabilities. It is more a brain-based disability, and therefore the dysfunction happens in the brain. And these individuals often struggle with things like executive functioning. That's what my research is in, what you just said, Allie. And that's like planning and organizing and attention and impulsivity. All of those skills are processed with executive functioning. They're all considered types of executive functioning, and that is one of the major areas of deficit for people who have FASDs. Unfortunately, that combination of deficit areas um, leads, and the fact that this is not a widely known disorder or category of disorders, it leads to people who have this disorder or who perhaps meet criteria but don't have a diagnosis, leads to the label of troublemaker, especially in the schools. And a lot of times, kids who get labeled as a troublemaker early on, we're talking preschool and kindergarten, those kids end up being put in an alternative learning environment or a behavior classroom.
It is
And
so hard to come back from that label.
it
A
really
label
is.
is so hard to break.
It really is. You're right. It is so hard to break. And what happens with the kids who have FASD but don't have a diagnosis, who get put into those ALE classrooms, they then go through what's considered the pipeline to prison. And so we see those kids end up getting in trouble with the law. In fact, the kind of common age for first encounter with the law for kids who have FASD is 13,
Oh, wow.
which just, in my opinion, is a system issue. That means the system does not have those supports put in place so that those kids don't end up having that encounter with the law. And that goes for all of the kids who have FASD, but especially kids who also are kids of color. They end up getting that encounter with the law even more so. So some kind of common characteristics of kids who have FASD. Sometimes I'm a speech language pathologist by trade, and so I'm always looking at communication and language. And kids who have FASD sometimes have lower language skills, but it's not always low enough to qualify for them for services. Those scores aren't low enough to qualify them. So there is a struggle in language processing and these other executive dysfunction happening on top of it, and yet the resources just aren't there because the scores aren't low enough on paper, unfortunately. um, Oftentimes these kids don't understand consequences, so cause and effect doesn't always make sense to their brains. And a lot of times these are the kids that are doing what we consider big risks for little gain. So they're doing these things that are really dangerous, or that might get them in trouble, and there doesn't appear to be a good reason for them doing it. A lot of times those are the kids that get told to do that by the group of peers, or bullies, is what happens a lot. Sometimes these kids to appear to be lying about things, even though that the person they're having a conversation with can prove that they're not telling the truth. And that is actually more to do with the damage done to their brains prenatally, by that exposure to alcohol, rather than them being just malicious. Sometimes these kids also have learning difficulties, although again, most times those scores aren't low enough to qualify them for any services. And a lot of times they have average IQs. IQ does not appear to be a common area of deficit in general. Fetal alcohol syndrome sometimes is associated with lower IQ, but that is only about 10% of the FASD population.
So tell me a little bit about that population. What are the statistics? How many individuals are actually diagnosed, or how many individuals go undiagnosed?
Yeah, so May, a researcher named Dr. May and his colleagues in 2018 published an article in JAMA that showed they took a group of 2,200 first graders and they looked at criteria for FASD and to see what the prevalence is in the country. And what they found is that between 2 and 5% of the population meet criteria for an FASD. And so that's roughly 1 in 20 people, which is twice as prevalent as autism spectrum disorders. What they also found is that of those 2 to 5% that meet criteria, only 1% of those kids already had a diagnosis. And the diagnosis that they had was fetal alcohol syndrome, which we just talked about is the most profound.
Mm-hmm. So can we touch on that for just a second?
Yeah.
Why are we not hearing about that? Is that just the education that goes into it? Why are we hearing so much about these other diagnoses, about autism, about Down syndrome? When we hear a new statistic comes out, we are flooded through social media, through blogs, through our legislators. There's so much money that we want to get pushed out to these other areas. If the number is that high, why don't we know about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So part of that is because there's just not enough people talking about it. There's not enough research going on about it. And then part of it is that unfortunately there's not enough money to fund that research. I think that is shifting. HRSA just funded $1 million grant for FASD research. So fingers crossed in the next 30 years or so, FASD will be talked about as much as these other developmental disabilities. But it all boils down to that we just don't have the training for it. We just don't have the experts in the field. They are out there, but they are very, very few, especially in comparison to these other developmental disabilities. So yeah, we need to increase that training for diagnosticians, that there needs to be training for people who provide intervention so that they are aware of FASD and they know how to properly provide that intervention. And then, I think these kids are getting diagnosed with other conditions, misdiagnosed. A lot of these kids get diagnosed with ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. And those are all like the troublemaker labels, and so instead of looking to see what the common cause of those characteristics is, we as a society just kind of stick them into a category and keep them there. Like, oh, this kid is acting bad because they have ODD, instead of actually they have brain damage and that's why they're displaying these characteristics.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I want to ask a question, and I may be just far off in left field, and you just reel me back in. Um, how much stigma is still circulating FASD? And if there is stigma, how much does that have to do with not being able to be diagnosed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is a lot. There's a lot of stigma associated with it. In fact, that's another reason why people aren't talking about it, because the main characteristic, the main criteria for these diagnoses is that there has to have been prenatal alcohol exposure. And it is really easy to blame the pregnant parent for that. But what we don't think about and what we don't talk about enough is that there are lots of reasons that pregnant people drink, addiction being one of them. Alcohol is extremely addictive. Another one is that I think the majority of pregnant people find out that they are pregnant between weeks 6 and 8 of pregnancy. And the critical time for central nervous system development, that means brain, spinal cord, the critical time for that development is week 3. So most people don't even realize that they're pregnant. And if you are over the age of 21, then it is very legal to drink alcohol, right? And so if you don't know you're pregnant and you're drinking, that can also that can cause fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And so the preventative aspect of it is causing this stigma, whereas what needs to happen is more education about what causes FASDs and when is the important time to not be drinking. And the other thing that happens is that physicians, primary care physicians, other medical professionals share misinformation saying that it is okay to drink a glass of wine during your pregnancy is okay, or just a little bit is okay, when in fact FASDs can be caused anytime a pregnant person drinks,
So
anytime.
you're talking about a nice fancy dinner with a glass of wine and you're not knowing you're pregnant.
Right, exactly. There's no proven safe amount of alcohol to be consumed during pregnancy. Also, every person metabolizes alcohol a little bit differently, and that depends on lots of things like body size and genetics and all these other things that go into how you metabolize it. So that is why the literature hands down says there is no proven safe amount of alcohol uh, during pregnancy. The CDC even recommends complete abstinence if you're even trying to get pregnant.
And that's just because you don't actually know when you get pregnant, I guess,
Exactly.
from what you're saying.
Exactly. And
Okay.
that's why it's so easy to put that blame, to put that stigma on the pregnant parent, where in fact, how can we do that? They didn't, a lot of times they don't know, or that there's these underlying mental health conditions like addiction, like self-medication, those sorts of things that play into it. And unfortunately, that is just keeping the stigma of the diagnosis itself going.
And we already know there's a lot of stigma that still lies around mental health issues and
Right,
mental health conditions in our country. And we don't make it easy to receive, help or treatment.
right.
And so I guess that's just a vicious cycle that we have
It
here.
is. It's a
And
system breakdown. It is purely a system breakdown.
okay. So you're telling us that there's a stigma around receiving any type of help in the first place, which leads to having trouble receiving a diagnosis. And then I guess that would lead to receiving early intervention help. And so and that's just a snowball effect.
It is. It is. Most people who do get a diagnosis of an FASD don't get it until right around first, second grade. And
Okay.
so that's you have missed a completely critical time period for that early intervention when you're diagnosing so late.
Okay. And so tell me this, and I just want to circle back. You're telling us that there's not a lot of information. Are any educators trained to look for FASD?
Well, there are training programs that have been developed throughout the country that can train educators. In the state of Arkansas, our team at SDRC has trained several school districts. We've also trained. I'm a speech language pathologist, so I've trained groups of SLPs on FASD and to bring awareness to that. But it is not one of those things that's in like the regular education training protocols.
Okay.
And it needs to be, because if the prevalence is 1 in 20, that means one person in every classroom of 20 kids may meet criteria for an FASD.
Okay. So you're telling us how common it is. You're telling us the prevalence. Now, and you're telling us how hard it is to receive a diagnosis and those early interventions. And we already know the common theme in the disability community and how hard it is to obtain services. Shed some specific light on how hard it is to obtain the right services for someone with FASD.
That I'm so glad you're asking this question, especially to this group that's listening in today, because I think this is the type of issue that we need to be, as a team of advocates, need to be aware of. Getting a diagnosis of an FASD in the state of Arkansas is very difficult because there are only a few, and I'm talking like 3 or 4 physicians in the state
Wow.
who have experience diagnosing it. And then there's SDRC, which is our clinic. And so if all of those people who need a diagnosis come to us, our wait list is just going to continue to get longer and longer, which is why we're developing some trainings for diagnostic teams and hoping to get more teams around the state so that it's not quite so difficult to diagnose it. So the second part of what you're asking, though, is how can we get services for it after we get a diagnosis? And the truth is, this is the important part. Getting a diagnosis of an FASD does not qualify you for any extra services, even though these are the kids that are having such a hard time going throughout their daily lives, especially in the school setting, and then after school transitioning to adulthood. That transition can require lots of supports. But if we don't know about it, then those are the people that are going to end up in the prison systems, end up in the homeless community, end up, not having the supports needed to live successfully. The
Because
average,
FASD is forever, correct? Like, there's
correct.
no, okay.
Absolutely. And intervention, especially early intervention, the research shows that it can be very, very helpful. In fact, it can be extremely helpful. But the brain damage that happens prenatally as a result of exposure to alcohol means that damage lasts throughout their lifetime. So can a person with an FASD become a completely independent, successful adult? Of course they can. But more often than not, that requires supports to be put in place to help them be successful. And that goes for every adult.
Right,
If I
yes.
didn't have the proper supports in place, I promise you I wouldn't be successful. I would joke about this with my husband a lot because he does all the car stuff. He does, he has his spreadsheets with our bills. And if I didn't have him, I don't know. I don't even want to think about what would happen.
Wow.
So if we can
all require
transition,
those accommodations. We
yeah,
all
if
do.
exactly, we all do. And so some people just need different accommodations. But if they don't get those accommodations, then they're not going to be successful.
So tell me this. We know that we have to have a referral from our primary care physician to be able to see by a specialist. Is that standing in our way at all for most of us?
Yeah. So you mean for a diagnosis?
Yes, for that diagnosis, and then to be able to try to receive those services.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, the Specialty Diagnostic Resource Center is funded by the Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities Grant, the LEND grant, which I'm co-director of training for right now. Because it is through the university and it is grant funded, you do not have to have a PCP referral. In fact, if a parent is out there and says, I think this lady is describing my child, they can just go on our website and fill out an appointment form for us in order to get a medical diagnosis after that. So we provide that clinical diagnosis and we can identify where the real deficit areas are. But if they were to, for example, also meet criteria for fetal alcohol syndrome, that process would need the PCP's referral.
Okay. But that definitely would have to make it easier to be able to bring in that clinical diagnosis.
Right.
Yes, definitely, because we have some rural areas that do not have PCPs that are experienced in certain developmental disabilities.
Oh, I think most pediatricians are not experienced in FASDs, most of them. So yeah, it's unfortunate. The other part of the difficulty with getting services is that knowing what services to get, knowing what services to ask for, which I think anybody who has to navigate an educational system understands that. With FASD, if they have, for example, language scores that are low enough to qualify them for speech therapy, well, then that's kind of, I don't want to say an easy fix because I know it's not easy, but that is a clear-cut way to get those services. Most of the kids with FASD, their major deficit areas are in executive function and cognition, and then social skills. And that combination is not widely produced in the school system unless you know to ask for it. Additionally, there is not currently a Medicaid code for speech language pathologists to bill for cognition and executive function. There's a Medicaid code for language and swallowing and speech disorders, things like that. But this falls under the realm of a speech language pathologist's practice, especially if you want to get intensive intensive intervention. And there's no way to bill for it right now.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so it's another big problem. Psychologists can also do cognitive behavioral therapy, and there's some other evidence-based practices that are widely used with FASD. Trained professionals, like a lot of social workers, a lot of psychologists, but and this is where my research is coming in. And as a speech language pathologist, it is important to me for those deficit skills to really be practiced. You can't practice it if you don't have a professional who can bill for those practices, unfortunately.
Definitely, it speaks to the needs so much that we are not being able to meet for people to have the full quality of life that they deserve if we're not even able to bill for it through insurance. We don't have professionals that can do it. Just like you said, we are not able to meet it on a professional level.
Right.
And so I mean, it just circles back to how big the need actually is.
Yeah, definitely.
That, I mean, it's amazing to hear the number of individuals um, that are living with FASD, and to know that we have absolutely no way to bill for it. It's real that there's such a gap here. There is
Yes.
such a gap.
Yeah. I think the average age of death for a person with an FASD is in their 30s. And the most common cause of death for a person with an FASD is suicide. So
Not having the tools to live your life is very, very difficult.
absolutely.
Very difficult. And I mean, that's what we're here for. That's why we want to build strong advocates to advocate for individuals to be able to live their life full quality.
Yes.
So hopefully, with the information that you're giving us, we can build our tool belt up for that. So
yes.
Like you said, the individuals with FASD that are children grow up to be adults with FASD. They do that. And so being misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all or mislabeled in school, like you said, as troublemakers only for not having the tools that they need to be successful, that leaves them to struggle.
Oh,
It
yes.
leaves them to struggle. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, I think if any of us were called a troublemaker for long enough, we would probably start believing it.
Yeah.
And so that is why these mislabels and misdiagnoses are so detrimental, because they get in if these individuals get put in a category of being one of these hard kids to work with, then they're less likely to have access to other services that could really help them. So there are some services that would be helpful for all kids who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or most, I mean, everyone has their own, these are individuals we're talking about. They each have a different combination of characteristics, right? But things like social skills, pragmatic intervention from a speech language pathologist it would be very, very helpful. Intervention with cognition and executive function, we've already crossed that bridge, we've already talked about that. But other things that these people commonly have difficulty with are things like sensory processing, but in a little bit of a different way than perhaps some of the other developmental disabilities that are so commonly associated with sensory processing disorders. Behavioral and emotional regulation. There's a big stigma on any behavioral and emotional kind of disability, and when in fact intervention can be sought out for those individuals and can be very, very, very helpful. And then, there's always medication intervention, and a lot of people have strong opinions about one way or the other. One thing that I would point out is that if these kids have the wrong diagnosis, let's say a kid with an FASD gets a diagnosis of ADHD, The medication that is commonly used to treat ADHD might not work the same way for this kid. So a lot of times it's a struggle for the families too, because it's a constant kind of rechanging the formula, what medicine works, what medicine doesn't work. Um, and that's because it's not true ADHD. There's something else going on. So we see this is a there are certain populations of kids that have higher prevalence of kids with FASD. The foster care system is one of them. Upwards of 17% of the foster community meets criteria for an FASD. That's almost 1 in 6 of the
Wow.
kids. Yeah. So it's just a really prevalent issue, and we just don't have enough of the resources yet.
Well, as hard as it is for children that aren't in foster care to receive a diagnosis, I can only imagine how hard it is for the children that are in foster care.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. This is very eye opening. Very, very eye opening. I'm sure it's very eye opening for the individuals that are going to view this segment. So, can we dive into what we can do to be an advocate or an ally for individuals with FASD? I mean, you've given us a wealth of knowledge um, just to learn about FASD, and I mean, really answer questions that we may have not even known we needed to be asking. And I think that
Right.
that's really important. And that seems to come up a lot with, segments like this, or really listening to people who are experts on certain subjects. But that, our job is to be advocates
Right.
for people, not just ourselves or for our own children or for our own loved ones, but we need to be advocates for other people so we can open doors for everyone and we can make stronger, inclusive spaces for everyone. And we can take those back as, ours.
Right.
And we don't, it's not just as very inclusive for me or very inclusive for my child. It's a completely inclusive space where we can demand equity, and that's what we want. And then we can
Definitely.
start demanding justice in that space, and that's what we want. We want to just get that ball rolling. So that's why we want to teach people how to advocate for someone else, for themselves and someone else. And so tell us how we can be an advocate and an ally for someone with FASD.
Yeah, I think there's some pretty simple steps to start that process. And one of them is just increasing what you know about it,
Okay.
increasing that identification of these common characteristics. And then once you learn about it, pass that knowledge on to other people. We just need to start talking about it more. And this is the perfect type of space to have these conversations, because if we don't talk about it, then how are we expected to know about it? So just educate yourselves on even just the basics of FASD, so that then you can help advocate for people who might appear to have some of these common characteristics. And then the other thing that we
So
can do.
I want to stop you right there. I just have
Sure.
a question for you. So when I was prepping for this segment, I watched a TED Talk, and on this TED Talk, it was a mother of an individual who had FASD. She was actually a foster mother, and she had taken in over 100 individuals. And she told me, or me personally, because I was watching the TED Talk, I was very involved. But she told everyone that she recommends doing something about it. So she said that she told one of her children to do whatever you need to, and one of her children had ended up going to jail because she told them to dump out pregnant women's alcohol, and he would do it again. So, and that made me feel personally like I would be judging someone who is drinking that alcohol. So is there a better way to think of women who are pregnant drinking alcohol? I feel like that's almost staying on that same train track of judgment, if that makes sense.
Yes, it
Okay.
and I, again, there are lots of reasons that pregnant women drink, lots of reasons. And one of those reasons is because they don't know. They don't know what it can happen. I'm not going to say that it's a good idea to go knock out a person's drink out of their hand, but
Yes.
if we can talk about the things that can happen if alcohol is exposed to a pregnancy, then perhaps that preventative side of things can start getting the support it needs as well. There was a signage law passed in a couple of years ago in Arkansas saying that restaurants and stores that sold alcohol had to have this sign up saying that alcohol can cause birth defects and can cause developmental disabilities. And several years ago, that same type of law was passed for cigarettes. And now the education about how bad cigarettes are has happened. And although there are plenty of people who still are addicted to nicotine, it is those types of educational pieces are everywhere now. We know it. We need to do the same thing for alcohol too, and just share how detrimental it can really be without thinking that a pregnant person is deliberately trying to harm their child. I haven't met a single pregnant person who ever has deliberately tried to harm their child. And I think it's just boils down to some people don't know. And if practitioners are given misinformation too, then we have to work even harder to educate that side of things as well. Not just the people consuming the alcohol, but the people who give advice to pregnant people. So
So it's very much um, that mindset shift and not
yes,
fostering so much judgment and being able to be open to talk about these things, making ourselves knowledgeable about that instead of just ready to be a warrior and a crusader on this, to be able to actually make the moves to foster something else other than judgment.
right. Exactly. Because if we are consumed with judgment, this group of people is not going to get the help they need
Okay.
because
Okay.
it's just going to increase and intensify the stigma associated with it.
Okay, definitely. And I feel like that could be from the mother into a school district, because if we're not talking about FASD inside the school district, then knowledge and that education for the teachers or even the other students is
Hmm.
going to be passed around and accepted.
Right. Exactly. And my son has ADHD, and
Mhm.
so I have personally had to navigate the educational system, getting a 504 plan, those sorts of things. And as someone who the ADHD is very, very common, 1 in 10 children, and it's not stigmatized like FASD is. So as a mom of a child with a disability who did not have to worry about that extra added stigma, it was hard enough for me to navigate that system. And that's where the advocacy team can come into place and be that help and that support that parents need to help their kids.
Definitely, definitely. And you never want your child or any child to feel like they're ashamed of being who they are. And
Right.
FASD would definitely be a part of who that person is. So they shouldn't feel shameful to tell someone, I have FASD and this is why I feel like this, or this is why this happens sometimes, or this is why, I do this instead of doing this.
Right.
And if they can't talk about that, then no one ever gets to harvest any acceptance, even that person for themselves.
Right. And I would even take that one step further and say, if we're going to teach our children to advocate for themselves, then we better be teaching everybody else to listen.
Yes,
Because if they
definitely.
are telling you that they cannot do something, or if they are telling you that they need help with something, then that means they can't do it and they need help.
Yes.
So that's another soapbox that I can get on another perhaps another
I mean, we have
conversation.
15 minutes, so if you want to stay.
Yeah, but it is important. It's so easy to get caught up in things like following the Common Core rules, and oh, I've got to get all of these kids tested, and oh, I've got to I've got to put my notes together for my treatment plan, and I don't have time to like really listen and for goodness sakes, you were able to do this yesterday. Why can't you do it today? That's another common characteristic, side note, of people who have FASDs. They have a variability in their skills. So some days they will be able to do something, and then some days they will not be able to do that same thing, or will need some extra help with it. And so again, it's very easy to get, as a professional, to get into this frame of got to do all of these things that are expected of me, and I can't focus my attention on somebody who is causing trouble in my classroom or causing trouble on my caseload. And we have to shift that thinking to open our ears and be able to listen to these kids who are crying out for help. Behavioral, big, explosive, emotional episodes that happen very often with this population, that is a cry for help. That is not, I'm a bad kid and I want to throw a chair across the room. That is, I cannot process what's going on around me, and I don't have the tools to be able to do anything except pick the chair up and throw it across the room.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we just have to be shifting our mindsets.
Exactly what you said with tools. Before we even get to that point, sometimes as adults we ask children to come up and meet a bar when they don't have the tools to get there.
Exactly.
And and that causes them to do the only thing that they can do. The only thing
Yes.
that they can do. And sometimes, and that's our fault.
Yes, it is.
That's
It's
our
a
fault.
system problem. It
Mm-hmm.
is. It is a system problem. And it might be thinking, instead of lowering our expectations to their bar, it might just be changing what we expect of them. So not expecting less, but expecting different.
Different.
Mm-hmm.
Different. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. We have a saying at work and at home. So like here at Community Champions and here even in my house is, um, you know, in the future you can do whatever you want to do. But even here right now, whatever you are is completely acceptable. Like whatever you have to give right now is exactly what we need.
Right. And
And
what, oh, go ahead.
no, and I just think that that's so important to let people know exactly what you have to give right now is needed somewhere. It's going to be beneficial to someone at some point, and it's usable. You're
Yes.
not wasteful. You're not nothing. And so I think that we need to make sure that we have a place for these children and every person. So
Mm-hmm.
we're not striving for something you can do in the future. You're completely usable right now.
Yeah, I agree. And what you're describing is, if you go back to like the theoretical framework for things, which researchers are always talking about theoretical frameworks for ideas, what you're describing is the social model, the social approach to disability as opposed to the medical approach. So it's not that we need to fix this person so that they can fit into our world. It's, we need to fix our world so that we can be inclusive of every person, no matter their abilities or disabilities, or no matter their skill sets. It's a total change of thought.
Definitely, definitely. And we all need to have that. We all need to be available to have that change of thought. So I know
Mhm.
I totally interrupted you. So you give us some more pointers of how we can fill our advocacy tool bag.
Sure, sure. So I think, like I said, educate yourself, know what to look for, then know where to refer to. And unfortunately, we've already talked about this. There's not a lot of resources in the state, which is another thing that we as advocates can do. Let's get more people educated. Let's get more people trained so that we can be a good resource. Um, but just increasing the awareness of FASDs and knowing where to keep your expectations or when to change your expectations. That is a huge thing. And then perhaps educating the people who work with individuals with FASDs on that same kind of mind shifting, thought shifting. Um, and there's some great resources available. Like if you're the type of person that wants to look for a handout or wants to look at a website or something like that, there's some fantastic resources available for fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and really in any time in a person's life who has a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, from school age to transition to adulthood, all of that stuff. again, Arkansas is unfortunately a few steps behind on being able to implement all those things, but that doesn't mean that a handout with steps of how to help isn't useful. You know what I mean? And so there's a couple of different websites that people can look for. One of them is our website at the Specialty Diagnostic Resource Center. And if we can put that in the chat, and let me just, sorry, my mouth went dry all of a sudden. 1 second.
All this wonderful knowledge you've been giving us,
I know.
can't see why.
I get so passionate. I just keep talking. So our website is www.arc, as in Arkansas, sdrc.org. And you can go to our website to find lots of resources about FASDs, and our team is on there. You can look at our team and you can see what kind of process it takes to get a diagnosis. There's also an option if somebody is just wanting to contact us and reach out to us, or if somebody wants to make an appointment. There's all of those options are on our website. Another really useful website is the NOFAS website. So that stands for National Organization of Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders. And the website is www.nofas.org. And that website, yeah, okay, perfect. That has fantastic resources on that website as well. Most states also have a NOFAS affiliate, so an affiliate with the national organization. Arkansas's is called None for Nine, and so they are a fantastic resource in the state, and there's a lot of really passionate people who are on the NOFAS team and on the FASD task force in the state. Their website, I believe, is arkansasnonefor9.org. And so that's another place to go and find some really handy resources in that way too.
We have that website, and we'll make sure that that's up on our Facebook Live video for everyone to be able to utilize.
Perfect.
Is there anything else that you want to give out to our listeners just to make sure they have available for, just any tools or tips? I think that we've covered so much. I think
we have
such a great intro to FASD.
Great.
Well,
I think I would just charge everyone, perhaps not to give them anything to do, but just to charge everyone to maybe be more aware that that just because a person seems to be having trouble getting along with other people or getting into fights a lot or having emotional outbursts, that doesn't mean that they are bad or a troublemaker. That could mean that there's something else underlying, and we just need to be very aware that those kinds of characteristics are calls for help. And this is a population that calls for help, and we don't have the tools to listen to them yet, but we need to increase those tools so that we can help them.
Definitely. Now, I want to ask you a question, and we might not have any answers to this, but there are going to be parents of children listening to this, and they may have come into contact with someone, their children may have come into contact with someone that you could have been describing. Let's say that they have had a unfortunate incident with this person, which their child perceived as bullying, or like I said, an unfortunate incident. Is there anything that their child could do if they couldn't make headway with this specific child? Can they go to the school and say, these are the characteristics that my child saw? Is there anything that they can do if they're seeing these characteristics in another student?
You mean as like a peer advocate almost?
Yes. So if their child could not make headway with this situation, if they couldn't be passive because it almost got to a bullying situation,
Sure.
if that makes sense.
Sure.
Could the parent go to the school and say, these are the characteristics that I saw in this, from my child's perspective? Is that overstepping, or would that just be information that they should share?
That's a great question, Allie. So I think that it's really easy to get protective over your child. And if your child is saying there is one specific person who is doing something to harm me, then it's an immediate reaction for us to want to go and say, hey, look at this one kid. But I think what might be more helpful in that case would be for the parent to go to the school and say, let's talk about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Let's talk about this combination of characteristics, and let's all be aware that these characteristics are out there, because my guess is if that child is experiencing that bullying from another kid who perhaps does have an undiagnosed FASD, there's more kids in that school system that also are going through those same struggles. So it would almost be better to educate the teacher as a whole and then the teaching staff as a whole, instead of just singling out the one kid. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
Yeah.
I think that answers all of our questions, and I don't think that we have any more questions coming in via Facebook or email. And so I think that basically wraps up our first Food for Thought Friday with you, Dr. Cleveland. I hope that you will come back and speak.
Oh, anytime. This was fun for me.
Wonderful. I'm so glad. You will actually be presenting at the Famous Family Bistro on a more thorough FASD topic. You will have a full hour to yourself presenting with a full presentation. And we will definitely put that up on Community of Champions website, and everyone else can find that on the Parent Advisory Council Facebook page. And I'm sure you will be sharing that too. So we will definitely let our viewers know exactly when that's coming out. But if you don't have any more questions, we will let you get back to your day. Once again, this was Dr. Elizabeth Cleveland on FASD, and I'm Allie Tomlinson with Community of Champions. We appreciate all of you for tuning in, and please participate in the survey and let us know if you enjoyed today's content. But please, please, above all else, use the tools that you were given today. Make sure that you become a strong, confident advocate, just ready to take action. And we'll see you next time on Food for Thought Friday.